Watchers in the Fourth Dimension.
Beware the Black Guardian.
Beware the Black Guardian.
Beware.
Doctor, you shall die for this!
It's funny, you know, but before I met you, I was even willing to be impressed.
Hello and welcome back to Watchers in the Fourth Dimension. I'm Anthony.
I'm Julie.
And I'm Riley.
Well, we've completed the quest for the key to time, and here we are at another season retrospective. We hope that you're excited for our usual blend of awards, quantitative measures, and questions from our friends on social media. But before we get into that, I'm going to take a quick look at the mail. And this episode, we're focusing on mail from the androids of Tara. We start off with Nick Rutherford, who says, "This is one of my all-time favorites. The location is near where I grew up and I visited many times over the years. Tom Baker lived in a neighboring village called Grafty Green for many years. When his autobiography came out, I took it to his house to get it signed, and he asked if I'd come to mow the lawn. Tom apparently already had his gravestone prepared in the graveyard next door." Wow.
Morbid.
I just cracking up Grafty Green. That's so English.
Next up, David Gorton wrote in to say, "Interesting one this. In some ways, Grendel is a rubbish villain in that he can't help but telling everyone his evil plans at the drop of a hat. Basically tells Romana everything in part 2 and the Archimandrite everything in part 4, although as stated in the episode, the latter doesn't seem particularly bothered. But Peter Jeffrey plays it so well and with such relish that you can forgive this indiscretion. I do enjoy the ending when, having had his backside handed to him in a sword fight, his parting shot is, 'Next time I will not be so lenient,' before jumping into the moat. A lot of fun, 7 broken diamond drills out of 10.
Nice.
Meanwhile, Kieran James Evans says, "Well, this is a favourite of mine and joint best of the season in my opinion. Great setting with a perfect atmosphere. The Count is such a great villain. The only time Cyril Shaps doesn't die. And I love Romana being confused on how to ride a horse. For me, it gets 9 out of 10 times of being too lenient." Next up, we have Mark Dunstan, who said, "Such a great story. Mary Tam on Tam action did not happen.
Aww.
All the characters were good, especially Cyril's Snap-on." Interesting name. I know it's Shaps. I am wondering if Mark was trying to allude to something with a reference that I'm not getting. I don't know. We'll give this 6 out of 10. But 6 out of 10 what, Mark? Moving on, our friend David Patty wrote in to say, "This story is a bit flawed, but it's so much fun. Baker and Tam are great, and the Count is one of the most enjoyable villains of the Fourth Doctor era. Not quite Count Scarleone, but getting there. We'll come to Count Scarleone next season, by the way. Always liked this one, I think because at the time it came out, it was such an obvious piss take. All the way through the 70s, the BBC would run classic serials on a Sunday afternoon. Androids of Tara riffs off the kind of books they'd choose to dramatize. Not just Zenda, but Dumas and The Man in the Iron Mask, and most of them were very, very dull. Androids was the perfect antidote. 7 out of 5, my crossbow shoots lasers, what does yours do? Out of 10.
Oh no.
Next up, the Whovian gal, better known as our one-time guest Naomi, said, "I'm a big fan of this story, probably more so than the 3 of you. Count Grendel is one of my favourite villains. I love to hate him. The history nerd in me is also very happy with the world building in the script. The idea that after the plague, Tara replaced its labour shortage with androids rather than evolving its systems of labour. That's a cool history-based explanation for why they are simultaneously feudal, but also have laser swords." Another voice that loves this one is Kat, better known as Citrine Dragonfly on Instagram, who said, "Loved this story when I saw it on VHS in the 90s and still love it today. Mary Tam's purple costume and that hat are to die for. I wanted that outfit so badly. 7 out of 10 canines in boats for the episode, and 10 out of 10 hatters hats for Romana's Taran outfit." Meanwhile, our resident fan of beauty, Austin D. Patterson, commented, "Androids of Tara to me is the perfect example of a middling Tom Baker story. It's got medieval influences, some kind of supernatural element, Tom having a laugh, and it's just fun. Mary Tam acts her chops off, and so does the actor playing the Gracht. This is the perfect episode to watch on Sunday when you have nothing better to do. 6.5 out of 10 unnerved Cyril Shaps. And it wouldn't be our mail if we didn't end it with the one and only Astrazon Danglebert Zebulon, who stated, "This episode is fun. Mary Tam and Peter Jeffrey just own every scene they're in, while again, the Doctor is just a side character that obnoxiously chews his scenes like an overcooked ham steak." 6.5 out of 10 fishing side quests. And that brings us to the end of the mail. As you've just heard, we do love to hear from you all, so please do write in. You can contact us with your thoughts, comments, and questions through Facebook, Instagram, and the platform formerly known as Twitter at Watchers4D, or you can drop us an email at watchers4d@gmail.com. We really would love to hear from you, and as you've heard, we do read as many of your messages out on the show as we can. On top of that, if you're not already subscribed to the show, we would really love it if you went ahead and did that. And if you haven't left a review or rating on your preferred podcast platform, please go ahead and do that as well. All of those things really do help us out. It gets us more exposure, gets more people listening. And that's really all we want in life is more listeners. Maybe. Maybe we have some other desires. Who knows? But with that out of the way, we're going to go right ahead and dive into our Season 16 retrospective. And as a reminder on how this works, we start with our awards, and then we'll go and take a look back at our various scores and metrics from across the season, and then answer questions from our listeners, which we have gathered through our social media channels. As always, we will respond in reverse alphabetical order. So Riley will answer first, followed by Julie, and finally myself. And we will go right ahead and dive in with our best and worst stories. And as a reminder, the nominees are The Reboss Operation, The Pirate Planet, The Stones of Blood, The Androids of Tara, The Power of Kroll, and The Armageddon Factor. Riley, over to you.
Well, this isn't close to me. It is clearly The Stones of Blood. Looking at the season as a whole, there weren't any serials that were absolute smashes like we've had with previous seasons, but The Stones of Blood is the only one that got close, in my opinion. Great pace, good twist, there's humor, and there's excitement because it's really unusual. I believe we said that this was a parody of The Demons, and, there isn't anything wrong with that. I enjoyed that element of it. And the sudden switch to a legal drama in the back end of the serial was fantastic. For worst story, this one was a bit closer, but I'm going to go with The Power of Kroll. The location was drab, the story was straight out of classic Doctor Who tropes, and looking back, this is a serial where I feel the lack of female characters besides Romana really stands out. Maybe it's because I had just been thinking about The Stones of Blood, but The Power of Kroll feels just so flat and basic, and I can't help but think how adding a female character to maybe the refinery crew, or, I don't know, maybe the women of the Swampy tribe would have helped, right? Provide some new perspectives, some new themes. I mean, the Swampies don't asexually reproduce, do they? Or do they? I guess that's maybe that's the power of Kroll. Okay, I've been waiting for so long to do that. Anyway.
All right, Julie, over to you next.
Well, I somewhat agree with Riley and somewhat not. Best story, hands down, The Stones of Blood. This should come as no surprise to anyone, as this got my 10 out of 10. I loved it. The women were spectacular. The plot was great. There weren't any glaring big giant holes in there. We got some really scary scenes, even though they were just moving stones. And we had some really visually nice villains when in the past we got crinkly paper. So yes, The Stones of Blood is awesome. My least favorite is the Armageddon Factor. It's too long. It drags. It is boring. And part of it doesn't make sense. And it has my least favorite trope of all, mind control. We all know how I feel about that one. So yes, that's what gets it in my book.
All right. Thank you, Julie. I think we're all aligned on The Stones of Blood being the best of the season. And you two have said, I think, all that needs to be said about why it's so good. However, I do want to take Riley to task on saying that there are no smash hits this season. Because when I look at our scoring for The Stones of Blood and compare it against everything else we've done so far, it is our third highest scoring story of all time. So far.
Yes!
Maybe it's because I don't think I put it any higher than 8.5.
You didn't.
See, okay.
But Julie gave it a 10 and I gave it a 9.5.
Then fair enough. Then it is a smash hit.
Consider yourself put in your place, Dr. Shrek.
I am corrected by the stat keeper.
I will also agree with Julie on the Armageddon factor, mostly because I think it's an incoherent and inconsistent mess. It tries to do too much, there are too many weaving storylines, and with any Bristol Boys script, again, I don't know why they thought they were a safe pair of hands for this, because they're quite clearly not, because they need a lot of oversight, a lot of work, and a lot of help to actually get something that works well on screen. And they were put there because they thought, oh, we don't need to supervise them much. They've written 9 stories for us. Yeah, 9 stories that have had very heavy edits. So for me, it just doesn't quite work. It doesn't wrap it up well. And it starts out with a very promising premise, but about halfway through, it just goes rapidly downhill. At least the power of Kroll is consistent. So for me, very much the Armageddon factor. Next up, we move into best moment and worst moment, and this can be anything from the season. And of course, Riley, once again, we'll start with you.
My best moment, I am picking K9's heroic holding off of the Ogre in the Stones of Blood. Looking back over the season, I was really struck with how many big moments K9 gets. I mean, before, he would be there for an amusing quip or as a means of getting out of the situation. But this season, he's really involved with some of the drama. And out of all of them this season, I think that his holding off of the Ogre after having almost being killed by them is certainly it. Now, for worst moment, it is a common saying that the worst thing that Doctor Who can be is boring. You can be goofy, you can be silly, just don't be boring. And that is why I'm picking the sword fight at the end of the Androids of Terra. It was giving me Third Doctor flashbacks, not in a good way. Mm-hmm. And I would not be surprised if David Fisher got tired of writing and said, to hell with it, let's just have a sword fight for 5 minutes. And I just want to take a break. So that is my pick for worst moment.
All right. I'm not entirely surprised by that. Okay, Julie, give us your 7 best and 7 worst.
I'll keep best to 2. And I actually might keep worst to 1. We'll see.
Wow. Who are you? And what have you done with the real Julie?
I know. Best moment. I have an actual good moment and, well, I say good moment, well done moment, and then a funny moment. And they're both from the Stones of Blood. Sorry, everyone. You should see this coming. I really enjoyed the fun one where Professor Rumford admits to getting arrested for carrying around a police truncheon. I think that's wonderful and does a really good job of actually painting the picture of who she is. But I really think one of the best scenes in that story is when those 2 campers are killed. That is so well done. It's so well even acted for just people who you met for 2 minutes. You only even find out the woman's name. You never find out the guy's name or vice versa. And yet it really gives you a sense of how dangerous the Ogre are. So that's my best moment. Worst moment. I mean, in general, it's the whole mind control thing that happens in the Armageddon factor, but specifically when K9 gets mind controlled. Because first off, he plays the damsel in distress twice in the Armageddon factor, and there is no reason why he should be mind controlled in the same way as everyone else, because that's dumb.
Yeah, I kind of figured that's probably where you would go, Julie. And while I don't have the same moments, my best and worst are from the exact same stories as yours. I think my best comes from the Stones of Blood, and really it's just the Megara being bitchy. Something about that is just so charming, how they get bitchy with the Doctor, they get bitchy with everyone. When they talk to each other, they're clearly arguing and the bleeping gets more and more animated. You can tell they're being bitchy to each other. They're just wonderful. From the Armageddon factor, this probably isn't the most egregious thing from that story, but for me, I think it's certainly the stupidest thing, and that is Shap's comedy fall backwards into the transmat shaft.
Oh, I love that.
It's unnecessary. It doesn't fit with the rest of the vibe of the story. It's just dumb. So that's my least favorite moment or worst moment.
I would like to point out that I find it so interesting that Julie's best moment was probably the most straight up out of a horror film scene in classic Doctor Who that I think we've ever had. And I feel kind of bad that I didn't pick it now.
But we did all pick things from the Stones of Blood, showing that story's strength.
Yep.
Okay, next up, Best Lead Actor. And for this, our nominations are Tom Baker as the Doctor, Mary Tam as Romana, and John Leeson as K9. Riley, get us started.
I really thought about this, and this may be a controversial selection, but I just want everyone to know that my decision was influenced by the fact that I believe that Mary Tam will get her due praise from both of you. So I'm going to pick John Leeson as K9. Now, as I mentioned in my best moment pick, K9 got a lot to do this season, and it was certainly a departure from the usual wisecracks. This was real dramatic acting, but he's having to convey it while having a robotic voice and without having an expressive face. That is impressive. So I'm going with him.
All right. I think that's fair. Julie.
I love to see K9 getting some love, because if I were to rate these in order, yes, Riley, you guessed correctly. Mary Tam as Romana got my number 1 spot. I probably would have put John Leeson as second, and then Tom Baker as third. And I'm sure everyone is just all up in arms about that. But Mary Tam is wonderful. She comes in strong, she comes in feisty, and she really remains the same. Yes, from a script perspective, I think they don't do her justice, but as an actress, she makes do with everything that she's given, and she's wonderful, and I want her hair.
Yeah, and I don't think it's going to be of surprise to anyone that I'm going with Mary Tam. I think my admiration for Romana has been obvious throughout the season, and I'm not going to say any more than that. Next up, Best and Worst Supporting Actor, and this can be anyone outside of our 3 regulars. So, Riley, who have you got?
Best Supporting Actor, I am selecting Peter Jeffrey as Count Riddle. His performance was the standout to me from the supporting cast this season. He really, really made me miss those smarmy master episodes with Delgado. I mentioned it while we watched Androids of Tara, and I'll mention it again. It's the closest I think we can get to a Delgado performance, and that type of villain is with him. He did an excellent job. Worst supporting actor. I am picking Paul Lavers, I believe that's his name, Lavers, as Farah from the Androids of Tara. There were several times in that serial where I felt his line delivery was incredibly disjointed and awkward. And now looking back at it, it would have been awesome if that was done intentionally to hint that maybe he himself was an android. But no, that was not the case. And I have to say, sometimes I feel uncomfortable selecting a worst supporting actor, because I'm sure working on classic Doctor Who in a small part was not easy back in the time. I'm sure the pay wasn't great. So who am I to say decades later, like, hey, I think you suck? So oftentimes what I do when I make my selections, I look them up on Wikipedia just to get a better understanding of them and their career. And I promise I'm going somewhere with this. I bring this up because I wanted to share that his Wikipedia article stated that in 2003, he was working for an English television channel, which was basically nothing more than an interactive programming for people to participate in using their mobile phone, like to vote and things. Like stupid things. For example, on one particular occasion, the audience was asked to vote on whether Nicole Kidman should, quote, give up everything for love. And what happened was that they did that. They left the phone number up, and of course, with the messaging charge. They went to commercial break, and they left the mics on.
Oh, no.
And apparently, it got caught with him and his co-host gossiping about how they thought she was a lesbian. And it became a thing that they actually had to make a big apology about it later. So I know that was quite a strange tangent, but I had to share.
Oh, no.
And I will say, he did sound a lot more natural when presenting, so I'm glad to see he has improved.
Wow, hot mic incident. Always fun. Okay, Julie, over to you.
Mine's just not as fun. I'm sorry, everyone. I did not go down a Wikipedia tangent. My best supporting actor, again, surprise, surprise, is going to be Beatrix Lehman as Professor Rumford in The Stones of Blood. I've already discussed how much I love her. I think she does a wonderful job, and she just interacts with everyone so well in that. Just everything about her is wonderful. And I'm sorry that I can't really expand much upon it other than just I love her so much, so dearly. And again, if her and some of our other very strong women who have been supporting actresses wanted to get together and do a spinoff, I would watch it 110%. Now, my worst supporting actor. The guys are going to disagree with me because we disagreed about it when we were watching and talking about this story. and that's Anne Terrard as the Seeker in the Vibos operation, because I thought that it could have been handled differently. And it's not that I'm really against the character per se. I just think that there's just, I think, a different way of expressing some of what was going on and have some other meaning behind it other than her just being batshit crazy. Because that's what it felt like.
Well, none of us have shown much love for the power of Kroll.
That's fair.
But it's his last appearance on the show, and he gave such a simmering, angry performance in the power of Kroll that I really do have to go with Philip Maddock as Fenner.
Of course.
He's just brilliant every time he's on, and it would feel wrong to give it to anyone but him this season, since I know we're never going to see him on the show again. So it's sentimental, my reasons for doing it, but I do actually think he puts in quite a good performance that contrasts well with the others in that story. And I'm still highly amused that his character is the last one standing effectively and left to the mercy of the Swampies at the end. So good luck to him. But he's my pick. As my worst supporting actor, William Squire as the Shadow.
Oh, really?
Yes. Oh my gosh, all of that stupid laughing Dr. Evil style. For God's sake, give me a break. He started well, he was quite menacing, and then he just laughs at the camera one time too many, and it just destroys him for me. So, sorry, but not sorry. It's William Squire as the Shadow. Worst supporting actor. Okay, best and worst villains. And to recap who we have on this one, in the Reboss operation, we have the Graf Vindicay. In the Pirate Planet, we have the Captain and or Queen Xanxia. In the Stones of Blood, we have Vivian Fay, also known as the Kaliak, also known as Cicer of Diplos. In the Androids of Tara, we have Count Grendel of Gracht. In the Power of Kroll, we have Thorn and or Kroll. And then in the Armageddon Factor, we have the Shadow and or the Marshal. And then, as a special nomination, we have the Black Guardian as the villain of the whole season. Riley, who've you got?
Well, this is always my favorite category. I feel like there's an excellent variety of villains this season. I did select Peter Jeffrey as the best supporting actor, but that doesn't mean that I believe that Count Grendel is the best villain this season. And I guess Anthony's going to disagree. I'm just a sucker for that cool classic death look. I'm picking the Shadow.
Oh, no.
I know.
I love it.
I mean, he does look really cool. I will
He
give you
looks
that.
so cool, particularly like everyone will focus on like the skull top half. But if you notice, the lower half of his face has this wonderful corpse-like makeup on it. It's so disturbing. It's wonderful. And to bring up what you mentioned, Anthony, is that the Shadow was actually very smart. He set up so many different ways to get the key of time just to fall into his lap. He didn't put himself out there. He had so many different angles that he was playing. And unlike some of you, I will not kink shame him. So I am picking him. Worst villain. Okay. You knew it had to happen.
Uh-huh.
I could have gone with worst supporting actor, but I don't think that was the case. I think it was a misunderstanding. But I'm going to say that the worst villain is the Captain from the Pirate Planet. Okay. I not only did not care for the performance of Bruce Purchase as the Captain, and as a villain, and let me emphasize, as a villain, I don't find the Captain as being effective. He is an interesting character, but having a robotic parrot on your shoulder that disembowels people and looking like you crashed headfirst into a bucket of Legos does not make you threatening or intimidating. You just seem kind of goofy, especially with how loud and boisterous you are. So that is my pick for worst villain.
Okay, well, I think we'll probably all agree to disagree. Julie, what have you got?
This one was tough for me because we had such an interesting array of villains. And I keep going back and forth between two. And then Riley had to go and actually make a very good point about the Shadow. Thanks, Riley. But I actually am going to go with Count Grendel. He was just so charming in the worst way. And every time he was on screen, I became invested. And that's saying something because that isn't always the case. So that's why I'm going to go with Count Grendel. All right. Now, worst villains, I go in between two as well. But for this one, I'm really probably going to go with Thawne and Kroll, kind of both. Because Thawne, he's just the stereotypical person that we've seen time and time again, and it's a little bit tiresome by this point.
The bad boss.
Yes, bad bosses. I don't love me some bad bosses. I have had them in the past. We don't want those. And then Kroll, it's a giant Brussels sprout that just has tentacles and really just wants to be left alone. So, like, not really a great villain. He's just minding his own business and everyone keeps trying to take stuff from him. So I totally empathize with the Kroll.
I understand, Jill. You're going to open up the Power of Kroll Conservation Society.
I mean,
justice for Kroll.
Yeah, sounds about right.
I do actually agree. And honestly, I don't really see Kroll as a villain. He's a force of nature and he just is. So while I came up with the list, it is very heavily based on kind of fan consensus of what the villains are. Not sure I would classify Kroll as a villain. I think the villain of that story is Thorn, and I'll come back to him in a second. My best villain of the season is my silver glamazon queen, Sasera Diplos. Yeah, baby, I went there. She's just a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm.
She starts off, she's chewing up the scenery. She's manipulating little pagan covens in rural England. And then it turns out that she's an interplanetary criminal. I don't know, something about her is just so charming to me. And yes, I was definitely thirsting over her when she showed up all silver. Yes, please. So, my best villain. My worst villain, I'm with Julie. It's Thorn. I don't need a genocidal oil rig worker. Thank you very much. It cuts a bit too close to late stage capitalism, and I'm good. I'm good. All right. Next up, we have the first of our two named awards, the Dougie Camfield Award for Best Director and the Dickie Martin Award for Worst Director. And our nominees this season are George Spenton Foster for The Reboss Operation, Pennant Roberts for The Pirate Planet, Daryl Blake for The Stones of Blood, Michael Hayes for The Androids of Tara and The Armageddon Factor, and Norman Stewart for The Power of Kroll. Riley, who do you have for the Dougie, and who do you have for the Dickie?
Okay, I'm going to start with Worst Director first, and the reason why? Because I don't have one. I just can't give anyone the Dickie because I just can't see over the course of the season how the difficulties with certain serials weren't due mostly to the scripts. I mean, I was poring over this, trying to figure out, like, well, was that poor? Was that poor? I'm like, but you can't blame the director for that. There's only so much they can do. I mean, think of The Power of Kroll. How do you make Swamp look good or interesting? How do you incorporate a giant creature where it's just hard to do? So, I'm not going to cheat and give the Dougie to everyone, but I think I'm going to give it, not necessarily to probably the best, I think the one that I sympathized with the most. In that one, I'm going to give it to Michael Hayes for The Armageddon Factor. And the reason why is he had the most episodes to deal with. He had a standard script filled with so many tropes. He had tons of locations to include. And yet I would argue at the end of the day, visually, not necessarily the story or the script, visually, it was still interesting to look at. So I'm going with him.
Interesting.
Julie, the Dougie and the Dickie.
All right. I mean, for me, I sound like a broken record by this point, don't I, guys? The Dougie's going to go to Daryl Blake for The Stones of Blood. And the main reason is, one, how do you make stones menacing? Well, somehow he did it. And two, you have these two beings that are made out of lights, and they're also interesting. So that is really impressive to me. And that's why I'm going to give it to Daryl Blake. Yay! And I know other people are involved with that, but still, I think that he did a wonderful job there. I am leaning towards Riley with the Dickie, and I do have certain scenes, probably from a couple different stories, probably each of them, where it's like, oh, well, this one could make it worse, or this one, like, I didn't like the way that The Seeker was directed, but that doesn't mean that it deserves the Dickie. The Pirate Planet, there was the time when they sped through that tunnel thing or whatever. Looked really bad, but that doesn't mean that the director deserves the Dickie. Armageddon Factor, there's a few questionable things there. The Power of Kroll, as mentioned. There's, what are you doing with this giant creature? But is it worth the Dickie? I don't think so. So I'm agreeing with Riley on that one.
Yeah, and for that reason, I'm going to do the Dicky first, and I'm just going to agree with both of you. I think there were things wrong with the Armageddon factor, and I do think Michael Hayes made one mistake and one mistake alone, and that was allowing William Squire to laugh at the camera too much. But that's not enough for the Dicky. And so, yeah, I'm also going to decline to give the Dicky this season. And I think that's the first time ever that all three of us have declined to award the Dicky.
Folks, are we getting too soft? I mean, I've heard that if you're a podcast, when they hit a certain age, they had certain medical conditions that might happen. For example, not being able to give the Dicky. And I'm afraid that this might have happened to us.
Oh, no. Ladies and gentlemen, and those who identify as neither, we went there. My Dougie, on the other hand, I'm with Julie and giving it to Daryl Blake. I think the range shown in the Stones of Blood was just outstanding. He does gothic, he does futuristic, he does horror, he does comedy. He gets the best out of an entire cast. There is no one in that I thought gave a bad performance. My only disappointment is the scene about running away to Plymouth that was cut from the final version. But that was probably due to time and might not have been Mr. Blake's call. So for me, it's definitely him, just because I feel like he has the greatest range out of everyone. That said, actually, I do want to give a special mention to Michael Hayes for the Armageddon factor, because that script really was all over the place. But boy, did that look good, and boy, did he get a good performance out of almost everyone. All right, next up, the Don Smith Award for Unnecessary Fan Wank. Riley, anything?
Well, I thought about this, and I'm going to present a question to both of you. What is fan wank? Would fan wank be the intentional, forced writing of a character done only to play into the audience's, I don't know, soft spot for the Doctor and perhaps maybe visualizing themselves? I mean, would that be fan wank?
I tend to think of it as
unnecessary canon?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's how I think of it, particularly when a writer's just trying to build lore for no good reason.
Okay.
There's no need for the lore. They're just like, well, I want to leave my mark here.
Okay.
That's how I see it.
Okay. In that case, I do not have anything, but I would like to point out that we were so close to something incredibly controversial. But I bet everyone can kind of guess what that is now, so I will move along.
No, I can't. What are you talking about?
Oh my goodness.
Don't leave us hanging, Riley.
Okay. You said unnecessary lore, and I was thinking, what was something that seemed like fan service that seemed unnecessary? And I'm thinking Benro from the Rebus operation.
Yeah.
Hard disagree.
Riley, thank you so much. I feel vindicated.
I thrive in chaos.
You're both fired.
Well, fine. Good luck with that, Anthony. No one wants to just listen to you. Yeah, I see where you're going with that, Riley.
Right. It's probably too far of a reach because it doesn't have enough lore to it. Now, if he was like a long-lost Time Lord or something, then yeah.
Yeah, if he'd been an exiled Time Lord who was posing as a native of Rebus and trying to advance them by telling them about this stuff, then yeah, I would agree. I honestly, Julia, I don't mean to jump over you, but the only thing I can think of as coming close is the Guardians. And I don't really think they're unnecessary. They're kind of crucial to the whole plot of the season. Julie, anything?
No.
No, me neither. We have no fan wank this season, ladies and gentlemen, and others. All right, best and worst use of music, Julie's favorite categories. Riley, let's start with you.
Who are the nominees?
Dudley Simpson, Dudley Simpson, Dudley Simpson, Dudley Simpson, Dudley Simpson, and Dudley Simpson.
Excellent. Well, I will tell you that Dudley Simpson was on fire this season. Really, all joking aside, I'm being quite honest here. I think this is probably one of his best seasons for music. I can't recall the last time where I mentioned the music so often and it was all positive and rarely negative. Really a lot of pieces and uses of music from him. I think this season is just fantastic. And I know it's going to be lame for me to pick my best use of music because it's so tame and basic. But I really enjoyed the ritualistic drums for the sacrifice and the power of Kroll. I don't know. It's so cliche, but his drums, I guess, didn't sound like the typical drums. I mean, they were drums, rhythmic drums, but they were a little bit different. There was more to them. Now, for worst use of music, it wasn't terrible, but in the Pirate Planet, when the Doctor steals, I wouldn't call it a spaceship, I guess a flying craft, the music does this very silly, victorious little melody, which I felt was a bit much, but more so, and more of a worry, it carried a little bit of keyboard in it. And I hope that Dutters is not going to begin relapsing back to synth and keyboard. So that would be my pick.
Okay, Julie.
I mean, yes, I agree with Riley. Dutters was on fire this season. I loved so much of what he did. And so I'll just pick two since Riley stole one of them. So I really enjoyed in the Armageddon Factor when Shap is kind of spying on going to catch the Doctor. It was a fun little playful thing, right? Of someone hunting someone else down. That was really fun. And then when the Doctor plays Matador in the Stones of Blood.
Good one.
It was really well done because it didn't just play Matador music. It then went smoothly into a transition back into the normal music that was being used in the Stones of Blood, and it did not seem disjointed. So that is why I think that's the best use of music. Now, the worst use of music, the only comment that I had was not even necessarily something that was bad. In the Androids of Terra, there was a weird harpsichord that was used in like a random time, not necessarily in the room where they were going to be crowning the king. And so I thought that was just odd, the placement of it. So it really was just more of an as opposed to bad use of music.
Well, in terms of worst, I'll start there. I'm with Riley. That little flourish when the flying craft is stolen, that could be cut. But otherwise, it's hard to pick something because Dudley was so good this season, and I feel like we're really nitpicking here. In terms of best, I'm going to go back to what was effectively the first scene of the entire season. When the TARDIS fills with light, and you get that wonderful organ music that Dudders has been doing so well for the last few seasons. He does some of it again in The Androids of Tara. Julie alluded to the crowning scene. But he's been doing really, really good work with organs, and that really gives that feeling of something impressive, something important, and I think it works so well at that point. So that's my pick. All right, well, that brings us to the end of our awards. So let's recap some of our metrics before we look at the scores. So in terms of our running metrics, this season, we had 18 instances of the camp count, which is the most we've had in a single season since season 4.
I can believe that, and that's starting to make a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, this season had a lot of camp. We did give 8 of those points for the Stones of Blood, which brings our total on the camp count up to 183.5 for the show so far.
Wow, so we almost got like 10% of our camp just this season.
Yes, we did. I'll explain later. Good season for that. We had 2 instances of it, which brings our series count up to 8. So 25% of it so far this season. And the first instance of it since season 12. Doing well there. We only had 1 quarry, would you believe? And that was in the Stones of Blood. We're not doing so hot on the quarries anymore. So we've now had 26 quarries in the show. I think that's good. And then in terms of jelly babies, we counted 10 as a bag. We had 35 jelly babies this season, up from 30 last season. That brings our full series count of jelly babies up to 77. So almost half this season.
Wow.
Looking back at our scores, so as mentioned earlier, our highest rated was the Stones of Blood, average of 9.33, followed by the Pirate Planet, 8.17, then the Reboss Operation, 7.67, the Androids of Tara, 6.5, the Power of Kroll, 5.33, and then coming in last, the Armageddon Factor, 5.17. And that gives us a season total of 7.03. Now, we've had higher, but I do want to point out that our average last season was 5.5.
Whoa!
So this is quite the bounce back. We had 7.78 in season 14, which was our highest ever. Season 15, we dropped to our lowest ever. and we're now back at around the 7 mark, which means this was a fairly average season of Doctor Who for us. I think if you look at our season averages all combined, you get something like 6.9, so this isn't too far off. In terms of how we each ranked the stories, Stones of Blood, highest for me, Rebus Operation next, Pirate Planet, Tara, Kroll, Armageddon Factor in last. Julie, surprise, surprise, Stones of Blood top, Pirate Planet, Rebus, Androids of Tara, Power of Kroll, Armageddon Factor. Riley, last but not least, your top was Stones of Blood, followed by Rebus, Pirate Planet, Armageddon Factor, Androids of Tara, and then Kroll. So your order was probably the most different from the main, but overall, I think we were all pretty much along similar lines. Now that everyone's least favorite section is done, with the exception of our friend Astrazon Danglebert Zebulon, because he is an agent of pure chaos, we will move into our questions from our listeners. And we have effectively 4 different themes that we have. So we're first going to handle questions on Tom Baker, then questions on Mary Tam and Romana, then the overall story arc, and then just kind of the vibe of the season.
Vibe.
Yeah, the general season vibe. Our first question, and it's a big one, comes from Nick Rutherford, who says and asks, by now, Tom Baker had done as many seasons as John Pertwee and was threatening to leave the show. Do you think they should have taken him up on his offer? And are you ready for a new Doctor?
Well, bye. No.
Bye, Felicia.
No, I enjoy Baker. I really do. But based on all the behind-the-scenes information that we receive each week from Anthony's diligent research, it really doesn't seem like it was worth all the headaches that he provided behind the scenes at this point, because that's affecting everyone else's performance. So as much as I enjoy Baker, it was probably time, I think, to move on.
I think I agree. As much as I love Tom, I think it probably would have been fine if it was his last season. However, I would have been really sad if the Armageddon Factor was his last story. So maybe give him a better one and then he can leave.
He definitely deserves better than the Armageddon Factor. Yeah, I think in terms of on-screen, he's still very charismatic. He's still very, very enjoyable to watch. And if we didn't know how much of a pain in the ass he was being behind the scenes, I would probably say let him stay. But yeah, he's causing them a lot of headaches right now. And maybe if I was Graham Williams, I would have just said, bye. But obviously that's not how it works out. So we will have him back next season regardless. Speaking of our agent of chaos, Astrazon Danglebert Zebulon, is it just me, or did Tom Baker just swing between sleepily phoning it in or chewing the scenery like a mad dog with rabies?
I think that's a fair joke. I mean, it wasn't his strongest season, performance-wise.
I don't know necessarily that I would say that he phoned it in, but it also felt somewhat that the Doctor got a bit sidelined a few times, a little bit more than I had seen in the past. And that really probably didn't help stroke Tom's ego that he was so desperate for everyone to do for him. So I could see where that also bled through, where he probably just wasn't feeling it.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think there were times when he was very charming and charismatic, and then there was the faux madness over having the key to time, which definitely I could see the teeth marks on the sides of the scenery. But I don't think it's his worst. He didn't seem to be belligerently non-compliant like he was with something like Horror of Fang Rock, where he just said, nope, I'm just going to be as aloof as possible because fuck you. So, he was okay this season. Not at his best, but certainly not at his worst at any point in the season. Moving on to Romana, and there are quite a lot of questions about Romana. And we will start with the most general of these. What did you think of Mary Tam's only season as Romana? And this question comes from David McCracken.
It was so good. She was so strong. She hit the ground running. She was fabulous. They decided to lean into it, gave her all the outfits, and she was glamour and everything that I wanted to see. I wish that they could have maybe not made her as much of a damsel in distress sometimes, but most of the time when she was captured, she just stuck her nose up and said, yeah, well, I might be captured, but I'm still smarter than you. And that was a wonderful thing to see.
Well, spoilers, I guess.
Oh, you already heard that she's out.
Yeah, I know. I just haven't had it in the story yet. But she was absolutely delightful. And as we had already talked about the Baker behind the scenes stuff, especially good considering the adversity that she had to deal with, which is just annoying. So it is kind of a shame that it's just a one and done with her.
I am going to challenge you a little there, Riley, because there wasn't a lot of adversity for her. Certainly not the same level that Louise Jameson had. She showed up, Tom tried to be a dick, she stood her ground on day one, won his respect, and everything was fine between them.
But then also, wasn't there elements of her complaining to the writers or to the producers about the fact that she was getting kind of turned into a damsel all the time?
Yeah, that wasn't Tom.
Right.
But I will
enough,
agree with that. I think she did deserve a little bit better. They could have handled the character better. She is a smart Time Lord, even if she is a little naive. Overall, I think she was handled quite well. I mean, obviously, I love her passionately, waiting for her to arrive in her own TARDIS and whisk me away. But yeah, I mean, she was fantastic. I would have loved another season of her, but obviously Marytam just didn't want to do that. So that's a shame. However, Citrine Dragonfly, otherwise known as Cat, takes this in a slightly more fashionable direction and asks, what do you think were the best and worst of Romana's outfits? And Julie, I know you had plenty to say on practicality of some of these, so I'm definitely curious as to what you might say.
Well, one, I think my favorite is just the iconic white dress with the fur cape.
Yes.
Oh, I love that so much. Just perfection. And it's hard to pick like a full outfit that I disliked, right? Because I think for the most part, they did such a wonderful job. Even one of the more practical ones where she had the hat, which, yes, it covered her glorious hair. She was still adorable in it. Let's be honest, anytime she had those stupid shoes, just any of those stupid shoes, just no.
For me, I mentioned this while we covered this story. The best outfit was the white gown and the Armageddon Factor. That was stunning. And worst, and they're all fun. I'm only picking this one because it just looked the silliest, and that would be that Jamiroquai-looking number in the beginning of the Androids of Terra.
Well, I was actually going to say I thought she looked stunning in Tar and Purple. Really elegant, and I actually like that look. So we're going to agree to disagree, Riley. Although close second for me is, as Julie says, the iconic look. The white, fluffy jacket. She looks great in that. And I will agree with Julie. Anytime she has impractical shoes, that's probably the worst thing they've done to her. And I get that it was done narratively to show that she's kind of a little bit naive and hasn't quite thought through the practicalities, but come on. Okay. Nathan Laws says and asks, I would like to once again challenge the Fourth Doctor Sarah Jane perfect companion combo received wisdom from fandom and ask the watchers how they feel that the Fourth Doctor dynamic with Romana works as opposed to either with Sarah Jane or Leela.
I gotta say, if I were to order the three, it would probably be Leela number 1, Romana number 2, Sarah Jane number 3. That's it. That's how I would do it. I just think that while I love Sarah Jane, she was done dirty with Tom's doctor. I liked her better when she was with Pertwee for that one season.
I completely agree. Although I would invert Leela and Romana. Romana would be my number 1, Leela my number 2, but it's very close. Very close.
I agree with Julie's order, and I would like to point out as a way to find how they work as companions, as an opposition. I feel just off the top of my head and really just boiling this down, it feels like Sarah Jane is the representation of the human heart, and Leela is the warrior and the fighter, and Romana is the intellect. And I feel like those are how they reflect the Doctor. In which the Doctor likes Sarah Jane because, as we've always noticed, well, particularly in New Who, the Doctor always seems to admire the heart of human beings, their emotional capacity. And the Doctor also admire Leela with her bravery and her honor, and also, well, Romana's time lady. So there you go. Of course, he's going to like that too and enjoy her intellect. So those are how they all bounce off of him. So that's how I look at them as different compared to the Doctor, or in their companionship with the Doctor.
Now you've put it like that, Riley, something just suddenly made sense to me. I find intellect so incredibly sexy, so I'm not surprised that I'm very much drawn to Romana. Anyway, I think I agree. I think all three of them work. I think Sarah Jane, the dynamic between her and Tom was fantastic. The writers just did her dirty and did turn her into a damsel in distress and didn't let her flex her journalist muscles enough. The dynamic between the Fourth Doctor and Leela got ugly towards the end. You know, it started out well as that kind of mentor-mentee, I'm going to make you better dynamic. And then it just kind of turned nasty and shitty in season 15, where at times he was just putting her down. And it just seemed so unnecessary and kind of ugly. Romana, Kieran James Evans asked Leela or Romana.
Leela.
We have just answered it.
Leela.
Romana.
Leela.
Romana. But anyway, agree to disagree. And then last but not least, on the subject of Romana, Tony Monticello asks what might be my favorite question of them all, possibly because of how he phrased it, where he asks, Romana and Leela spin-off show, missed opportunity, or should I stay off the gummies?
I'd 100% watch the hell out of that.
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm seeing here? I'm picturing a kind of Cagney and Lacey kind of two detective show or partner, cop partner kind of thing. They work together. I mean, it's a perfect balance. They're so different in personality and style, so you can also throw in a little bit of odd couple humor there too. It's perfect.
Yeah, good cop, bad cop. Leela gets to be the bad cop. Tell me the answer or I'll cripple you. So Big Finish kind of did a spin-off show. Their Gallifrey range is effectively led by Romana and Leela. So that's out there and it's a lot of fun. All right, let's talk about the story arc, because this is the first time the show has done a full season story arc. And we have two similar questions, so I'm going to read them both out. We'll take them kind of together, and then we'll take some of the other ones. R.L. Gray says, story arcs have become the norm in Doctor Who and a lot of episodic TV in general. How do you think this early experiment compares to more recent efforts? And do you think it's a good model for the show in general? And then Rob Levy asks, I would ask if this story arc was better developed and executed than arcs that would emerge in the modern show. I think the characters are richer and there is better storytelling, and I love a lot of these stories.
Well, I think that this first attempt is much like with evolution, imagining at first fish crawling out of the water trying to breathe. It was a valiant attempt, but I think we all agreed that the way that the ending of that arc was handled was very poor. I believe Julie said that, well, then I guess nothing really mattered. It was all pointless, just to return the segments of time of the keys back, just to disperse them again. And I've really thought about this. I love the idea of story arcs for a season. I can see that it can get tiresome, and I know that Who does it all the time, it feels like. And I think the new Who handles story arcs much better, or at least so far. This is only the first one we've had in Classic Who. I think that you just, like so many things in life, you just have to find a good balance here. I think having a story arc every single season, I believe there were certain seasons with the Moffat years, well, it just felt like, okay, here we go again, and like, what is it this time? You need to spread it out. Maybe just do it once every 3 seasons. Standalone episodes are absolutely fine. They allow your imagination to run wild about what else they could be doing instead of having themselves all focused around one thing for 10 to 12 episodes.
I obviously tend to agree with, I think, the beginning part of Riley's statement with it starting strong, liking the general idea, but its execution, especially at the end, was not well realized. I do think from Rob's perspective that I do think that there are a lot better characters sometimes in some of new series Doctor Who. I think that sometimes in New Who they make things weird just to make things weird. Love and Monsters, which doesn't even add to the plot anyway, so let's be honest, that's just a standalone that didn't need to be a standalone. But I think you can do story arcs, but this Classic Who one was so prescriptive, right? It was, hey, here at the very beginning, I'm telling you what this entire season is going to be about, and we're going to see how the season plays out. That, I think, is very tiresome. Whereas sometimes in New Who, you don't know what the question is at the beginning, and you figure things out as you go along, and then by the end of it, you realize that there had been something the entire time. And I think if you can mix and match with sometimes you know from the beginning, sometimes you find out at the end, and sometimes you just have stories that are just stories that don't add to the overarching plot, then I think that can work. But all that to say is, I think they did a pretty decent job, but they just need a better execution at the end of the day.
Yeah, I do want to say, I think Rob because I've learned to speak fluent Rob since I do another podcast with him. I think he was saying that he thought the characters in this season are richer than in the modern show. But otherwise, yeah, I think I agree with you. It's interesting that our across-the-board favorite story, for the most part, kind of ignored the key to time. They're obviously there looking for it, but it doesn't form a big part of the plot. Figuring out who Cesare of Diplos is or what have you and why she's terrorizing this village probably plays more of a part. And honestly, I still don't entirely know what her long-term plan was other than just to continue ruling this small village in rural England. But that doesn't make it any less magnificent. But yeah, I don't think the pirate planet, that doesn't make a big deal of the story arc. The androids of Tara doesn't. It's really only the Reboss operation, the power of Kroll, and the Armageddon factor, and two of those have to because they're the bookends of it. The power of Kroll, it's the reason Kroll is so giant. There would be no power of Kroll without the key to time. I mean, I'm sure if Robert Holmes wanted to, he could have found another reason as to why Kroll was massive, but the key to time provided the excuse to that. Anyway, I don't think it was better developed. I don't think it was better executed than some of the arcs we've had. We've had some arcs that I think have been very ham-fisted in New Who as well. Flux. I know Tony Monticello really enjoyed Flux, so sorry, Tony. I know you're listening. But I thought that was not that well handled. And spoilers for New Who, but, you know, that kind of ended with most of the universe destroyed at the end and no satisfactory conclusion or exploration of that ever again so far. Anyway, I think we've kind of touched on the next question, if not fully answered it, where Ben Flay asks, are standalone episodes better or season-long mystery box theme?
Yeah, I think we covered that. I don't know if everyone agrees, but I thought we were on the side of just mix it up.
Yep. And similar question, Peter J. Kane, do you think that the Key to Time arc of the series helped or hindered the individual serials and why? And I said 3 of them just basically mostly ignored it. It probably hindered the Armageddon factor, but I think it worked well for Reboss and it worked okay for Kroll.
That's fair.
Again, with the Armageddon factor, I don't know even if I would necessarily say that it hindered, because I just think that it was just mishandled in general, but I don't think it was the fault of the overarching story.
Let's give the conclusion to this 6 serial season-long story arc to a safe pair of hands with the Bristol boys. Jesus fucking Christ. All right, our friend Josa asks, is there anything about the season's overarching plot that you might change?
How it ended?
Yeah, I think we're all on the same page there. At least restore the balance before you break it up, Doctor. Come on. I still like the idea that maybe it was just the Black Guardian all along.
That would be the better idea.
Yeah.
That would be better.
Yeah, the Doctor was sent by the Black Guardian in disguise as the White Guardian and was doing his bidding unknowingly. That would have at least been fun.
I would have liked that, or just have the fact that the Black and White Guardian are one and the same.
Yeah.
That could have been interesting.
That would have been interesting as well. There is no light without dark, am I right? And then last but not least, Paul Arthur, aka Doctor Who 60s, 70s, and 80s, says Black and White Guardians, yay or nay?
Or about the Grey Guardians or the Blue Guardians? And, you know, I think we're just being too two-dimensional here.
I feel like I can't make a judgment on them because you don't really get enough background or characterization on them at all. I will say this, I do like the White Guardian's wardrobe, though. Very the architect from The Matrix meets Colonel Sanders.
We will see the Guardians again.
Okay.
Oh, really? Oh, boy. Oh, boy.
Not for a few seasons, but we will see them again.
Good or
A
bad?
little worried about that.
We'll see. I do like the fact that it wasn't the Time Lords, though.
Yes.
Yes. All right, the last ones, as I said, the general season vibe. So we'll start with Joseph Staub, who asks, the general consensus during the season 15 retrospective was that there was no consistency whatsoever during that season, whether in tone or even overall quality. Do you think that season 16 was a step back in the right direction as far as a feeling of consistency? And I'll go first. Yes. I do think it was a season of 4 really good stories and then took a pretty sharp nosedive to the end, but that was still a lot better than season 15. Definitely a step in the right direction. I think we were all in agreement that the first 3 stories were a lot stronger. Androids of Tara, a little bit of a dip, but not by much. And then Kroll and Armageddon were definitely the weak links. But yes, I think it's a step in the right direction back towards consistency.
I think it was evident from when you did your stats. The scores seem to be a lot more consistent. We back it up. Apparently we agree.
I was basically going to say the same thing. Like, well, we scored everything better and it went from 5 something back to 7. So obviously something went in the right direction. And what I still liked, though, is that it wasn't necessarily going all the way back to everything being gothic, but there was still some sort of cohesion that was going on that we hadn't had in the previous season.
Yeah. David Patty asks, the season swung towards comedy. Did it work? And do you miss the darker gothic style of Baker's earlier seasons? Well, I don't miss the companion being constantly brutalized.
True.
And I think they balanced the comedy pretty well in most of the stories. Maybe an argument could be made that the Androids of Terra got a little bit too comedy-esque. But when you have, again, the Stones of Blood, which we all know and love, and it was very comedic, and then you have that one horror scene that just kind of brings you back in of what's actually going on. And I think that brings it all back, and I think it worked.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
I feel like you can have both. I understand that this season is a lot lighter, but I feel like you can still have comedy with horror. I really do.
I think it'll be interesting to look back on this at the end of Tom Baker's era and assess where maybe it veered too much into comedy. I think we'll look back with a little bit of a different lens. Anyway, next up, Gaz Island. Do you miss having proper Who monsters in this season? You know, the bloke in rubber kind. Man in a rubber suit. I mean, the Shrivenzal was clearly a man in a rubber suit, and then the Fake Kroll was also a man in a rubber suit. We had them, but they certainly weren't as prevalent. I don't think so. I quite enjoyed the monsters we had this season, when we did have monsters.
I think they were absolutely fine. Of course, I love that old style, but I didn't think we really missed them. We had some good ones this year that were properly goofy/terrifying. I'm just glad that we aren't dealing with situations where we're shoehorning Daleks into serials that they don't need to be in. Speaking of monsters.
I think the only one that didn't work for me was the Taran Woodbeast.
Well...
Oh, he was adorable. Come on.
Just give him some
He just wanted a hug.
Yeah.
He just wanted a hug and a pet. That's all.
And we didn't have any horny shrimp, so that was a plus.
Definite bonus for the lack of horny shrimp. Okay, our very good friend, R. Alan Seiler. We are now 2 seasons into the Graham Williams era, and the 2 seasons were very different. But I'm wondering if you have started to detect patterns or themes, whether it be the characterization of the Doctor, or the way companions are utilized, or the types of monsters or villains encountered, that maybe define this era and differentiate it from all the others. Most people point to the increased levels of humor, but I'm wondering what other elements you might have picked up on.
Well, as Riley kind of alluded to, we haven't really had classic villains at all for the past 2 seasons, which is interesting because we've seen some things happen in New Who where you have no classic villains and everyone kind of destroys you for it. But in this era, okay, yes, we didn't particularly like the previous season, but in this season, we don't seem to care. They made some very interesting villains, and I didn't feel a lack of Daleks or a lack of Cybermen or a lack of some of these other classics. So,
and I do think that's a little bit of a carryover, because since the start of season 13, we've only had one story with a recurring villain, and that was the Master in The Deadly Assassin.
Crispy Master.
Crispy but greasy. But beyond that, we haven't had a single recurring villain, or at least one that at the time wasn't recurring. New Who has now brought back the Zygons and Sutekh and a few of these. But yeah, I think there's been some continuity from the Hinchcliffe era in doing that. I think the biggest difference to me is in tone, the move away from the dark and the gothic that we already talked about. This is a lot more lighter, and not just in terms of tone, but also often in terms of set lighting. You look at... You look at the spaceship in The Stones of Blood, and that is very bright in a way that really actually works. I think those are the big things for me.
I think the other one is if we look at our companions, they're not from Earth. And I think that's also a reason why we enjoy them so much, because as we've discussed, you don't need modern day Earth companions to make it interesting or to be the audience's eyes into it, that's a whole bunch of bullshit, let's be honest. Companions can be so much more interesting than just being my eyes. I have my own eyes. They don't have to be mine.
That's an excellent observation there. That really is about the companions. That's really, I didn't realize that. Didn't even pop into my mind. I think that what I've noticed is that the Doctor seems to be grumpy less often. And I'm wondering if that's where people are finding the increase in humor, since the Doctor's quips are usually the main source of our humor for the show. I also don't believe that we've really had any historicals, but I can't remember the last time we had one or something taking place in the past. Arguably, because of just the appearances, just the style and the aesthetic, you might say Androids of Terra, maybe? But that's not really, I would consider true. And I am noticing a bit more silliness and wackiness than ever before. And it was confirmed that when doing the metrics, Anthony mentioned how high our camp count was this season. So the show definitely seems a hell of a lot less serious. And especially when you think of the Stones of Blood, we were pointing out how the show was making fun of itself. We were thinking, like, were they just parodying themselves about how they killed off those villains at the beginning and so on and so forth? It just felt like that way. So it seems like the show just seems more lighthearted and less serious.
Just going back to the companions, one thing I do think is quite interesting is we're now 2 seasons in a row where the actress playing the companion has elected not to stay because they didn't think their character was being served very well. And 2 seasons in a row where Graham Williams was convinced that he could get them to change their mind to the point where he ended up having to change things very last minute, or in the case of the Armageddon Factor, not at all, in the hopes that they would stay. So there's clearly something not quite going right in how they're handling the companions.
But it's also interesting, too, because while we somewhat see it, because obviously they got a little bit sidelined or things like that, at the same time, these have been some of our favorite companions.
Yeah.
So I find that interesting as well.
I suspect it's that they were promised one thing and didn't quite get it. And I did see Mary Tam's point. You had multiple stories at the tail end of the season where she was captured, released, captured, tied up. Androids of Tara, she spent half the story escaping and getting recaptured. Mm-hmm. Power of Kroll, she was tied up, ready to be sacrificed, and then tied up and stretched. And then she spent some time in the Shadows BDSM dungeon in Armageddon Factor. So I can kind of see why she might have felt that this super intelligent time lady wasn't being served as well as maybe she'd been promised. Anyway, last but not least, Sean Collicutt. Do you think that this season peaked in quality of storytelling for Tom Baker's Doctor? I think that's hard to answer because we still have another 2 seasons to go. But looking what we've done so far, I think our highest rated season in Tom's era has been season 14. So I'm going to say no.
I agree completely.
Julie, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think the peak was probably 14.
We'll see if he has a late era bump, but let's be honest, probably not. Season 14 was just so strong, and I think it's regarded by so many as the pinnacle of Doctor Who for a reason. Well, that brings us to the end of our questions. As always, this has been a really enjoyable time to look back on the entirety of the season and think about it in its entirety, particularly given the overarching plot. So thank you for being on this journey with us. For our next regular episode, we will be kicking off season 17. We've talked a lot about the lack of returning monsters, but that is about to change as we will be starting with Destiny of the Daleks.
No!
Yeah, sorry guys. Do come back and join us for that. In the meantime, as always, thank you so very much for listening. And of course, have a good one. You have been listening to Watchers in the Fourth Dimension with Riley Schreck, Julie Philippek, and myself, Anthony Williams. This episode, Silver Glamazon Queen, was recorded on Wednesday the 26th of June 2024. If this is your first time listening into the show, all of our previous episodes are available wherever you like to get your podcasts. You can interact with us on Facebook, Instagram, and X at Watchers4D, and you can also email us at watchers4d@gmail.com. If you're enjoying the show, please do subscribe and consider leaving us a review or rating on your favourite podcasting app. All of those things really do help the show. And always remember, if you're doing a story arc, make sure you do it properly, for goodness sake.